It arrived in the mailbox like any other envelope. No handwriting, no return address. Just a printed label with my name centered neatly as if someone had pressed print, without thinking twice. I opened it carefully. Inside was a birthday invitation for my granddaughter Amelia, but something about it made my chest tighten. No love Gregory and Elise, no hope you can make it, Mum, not even a scribbled note in the margin. Just the cold formality of a time, a date, and a place. It was the kind of message you'd send to a distant neighbor, not a mother, not a grandmother. It felt like the beginning of something I hadn't yet understood, and something deep in me knew I wasn't supposed to go. I sat at the kitchen table, the card still in my hand, as the afternoon light spilled across the wood. The corners of the invitation were stiff sharp, like it had just come off the press. It smelled faintly of toner and cardboard. I turned it over once, twice. Nothing. No handwritten line. No warmth. Not even a signature. It wasn't the kind of invitation you save in a box for years. It was the kind you toss into a drawer and forget. But I couldn't. This would be Amelia's 9th birthday. I remembered the first one I ever went to. She had icing on her chin, trying to blow out candles too close together. Back then, Gregory used to beam with pride when I walked into the room. Elise, too. She even asked for my ginger cookies that first year, said they tasted like Christmas. Now all I had was this card, empty and polished. I placed it next to my coffee cup, watching the steam curl upward as if it were trying to carry my thoughts away. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to take the hint. But another part, an older, quieter part, refused to be dismissed like a piece of junk mail. Maybe some of you listening have felt it too, that shift in a family tone. It never happens all at once. It's slow, barely noticeable, until one day you realize the warmth has drained out and you are standing alone on the porch of something you used to call home. Still, I told myself it could be nothing. Maybe they were busy. Maybe they just forgot to sign it. Maybe. But even then I already knew. This wasn't an oversight. It was a message, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what it meant. I placed the invitation on the small table near the hallway mirror and left it there for a few days. Every time I passed by, I would glance at it hoping something might change. Of course, it never did. But on the 4th morning, I found myself reaching for it again, not to question its intent, but to accept it. I had decided I would go. It wasn't pride or hope that pushed me. It was something quieter. Maybe the memory of Amelia's tiny hand gripping mine at the park, or the way she used to trace the cover of the old fairy tale book I kept on my shelf. I remembered promising her I would read every story until she could read them on her own. That book, bound in fading green cloth, became the first item I set aside for her gift. I pulled a small wooden box from the linen closet. Inside were photos, postcards, letters, and tucked at the very bottom, the book. I opened it slowly. Some pages were loose and a few corners torn, but the illustrations still held their color. I placed it gently into a simple gift bag lined with tissue paper. Then I moved to the kitchen. I hadn't baked in a while, but my hands found the rhythm quickly. Butter, sugar, cinnamon. The same cookies Amelia used to ask for every Christmas. The smell filled the house like an old lullaby. I packed them in a tin layering parchment between each row. Once both gifts were ready, I sat for a while, hands resting on my lap. It was a strange calm. No butterflies, no expectations. Just a quiet readiness, as if my body had already accepted whatever was coming. Before leaving, I wrote a small card for Amelia, just a few lines in my handwriting. Nothing heavy. I told her I loved her and I hoped she had a beautiful birthday. I slid it between the pages of the fairy tale book, right where the story of the brave girl who crossed the dark forest began. I wrapped everything, carefully checked the address twice, and stepped outside. The sky was overcast, the kind of grey that made everything feel hushed. I took a slow breath, locked the door behind me, and walked toward the car. I didn't call ahead. I didn't text. I didn't ask permission. I simply followed the quiet thread of something unfinished, something still beating beneath all the silences. The drive was long but familiar. Every turn held a memory. The tree Gregory climbed at 10, the gas station where he bought his first soda, and finally their house. Still white with blue shutters, still trimmed lawn and flower pots. I pulled up across the street and sat for a moment watching families come and go with wrapped boxes and helium balloons. Laughter spilled out when the door opened. It was the sound of celebration. I looked down at the gift bag and tin on the passenger seat, then gathered them gently. One last breath. One steady step forward. I crossed the street and walked toward the door. Whatever waited behind it, I had shown up. That mattered more than they would ever admit. The walkway was lined with balloons, tied to little white stakes, swaying gently in the wind. I stepped over a stray ribbon and adjusted the bag in my hand. Through the front windows, I saw shapes moving, children darting around a few adults gathered near the kitchen streamers across the ceiling. The house looked just as I remembered it, but something about it felt foreign now, like it belonged to a story that had kept moving even after I stopped being written into it. I climbed the porch steps, careful not to jostle the cookie tin. My hand reached for the doorbell, but before I could press it, the door opened. Gregory stood there. His face was unreadable. Not angry, not warm, just still. He didn't look surprised, almost like he had been waiting by the door, listening for my steps. We stood like that for a few seconds, him in the doorway, me holding the gifts. Then he stepped outside and gently pulled the door closed behind him. I heard the latch click. The sound was quiet but final. He didn't speak right away. His eyes dropped to the gift bag, then the tin, then back up to meet mine. I opened my mouth, but he lifted one hand just slightly. Not to stop me, more like a signal, a gesture rehearsed. He said almost gently that it would be better if I didn't come in. His voice didn't shake. It didn't carry heat. It was the kind of tone people use when they're reading from a policy. Like a manager in a store saying this isn't personal, just procedure. He told me it wasn't a good idea, that it might make things uncomfortable, that the kids didn't need the stress, that Elise had worked hard on everything and didn't want distractions. Then he paused, like he didn't want to say the next part, but had decided it was necessary. He said, "And I remember each word, that I was not really a part of things anymore. Not in a cruel way, not loud." He didn't even make eye contact when he said it. He looked down at the mat beneath our feet as if the phrase had been written there, and he was just reading it aloud. My arms didn't move. I kept holding the gifts like they still belonged somewhere. Like someone inside might open the door any second and laugh and tell him he was being ridiculous. But no one did. I asked if Amelia knew I had come. He didn't answer. He just looked past me toward the road, as if he were waiting for someone else to arrive. I stood there for another long breath. Then I gave him the bag and the tin. I said nothing. There was nothing left to say that would land where it should. He took them with the same practiced stillness and turned the knob behind him. The door opened, swallowed the light, and then closed again. I walked back to the car, not in anger, not even sadness. Just in that kind of silence where something inside shifts slowly but permanently. I didn't start the engine right away. I sat there watching the house, wondering how something so familiar could feel so unreachable. That was the moment the door truly closed. Not just on the house, but on the version of me that still waited to be invited in. When I got home, I didn't take my coat off. I stood in the hallway for a long time, staring at the space above the entry table where I used to hang pictures. There had been one of Gregory there for years, holding Amelia as a baby, but I had taken it down last spring. I remember telling myself it was just to dust the frame, but I never put it back up. I moved to the kitchen and set the cookie tin on the counter. I didn't bother unpacking the small gift bag. The silence in the house pressed in close. There was no sound except for the hum of the fridge and the low crackle of the baseboard heater warming the tile beneath my feet. Later that evening, just as the sky dimmed into a heavy orange dusk, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Elise. She didn't start with a greeting, just the words, "Don't make this into a scene." Gregory already explained everything. There was no warmth in it, no curiosity about whether I was all right. Just a warning as if I had done something disruptive simply by showing up. I didn't respond. I set the phone face down on the table and stared at the wall. I don't remember exactly how long I sat like that. At some point, I got up and walked to the hallway closet. I reached past the coats and pulled out an old filing box. It smelled like cedar and dust. Inside were documents I hadn't touched in years. Deeds, old tax papers, letters from my husband when he was overseas with the VA. Buried near the bottom was what I had come for: the deed to the cabin in Walnut Creek, the place Gregory thought was already his. I ran my fingers over the name at the top. Mine. Still mine. No transfer, no cosign. He had always assumed that once he hit 35, the cabin would naturally pass to him. He talked about it like it was already his. The summer he said he'd install solar panels, the deck extension he never built. It was part of his story, but he never asked. And I never said yes. Back then, I told myself I was just giving him room to feel responsible. But in truth, I was tired. Tired of explaining. Tired of being reminded that my opinion no longer mattered to him unless it aligned with what he wanted. I folded the document gently and placed it on the table beside me. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a shadow in my own home. Elise's message was meant to shut me down. Instead, it opened a door I had quietly closed years ago. Because what they didn't know was this: I had never signed anything over. And if they were comfortable pushing me out of their lives, they might want to think twice about building their future on land that didn't belong to them. Not yet. Not ever, if I chose so. The next morning I woke earlier than usual. The light was still soft, not quite daylight, just that faint grey blue that settles over everything when the world is holding its breath. I sat by the kitchen window, a mug of coffee between my hands, and stared out at the empty street. The deed to the cabin lay beside me, still unfolded from the night before. My mind drifted back not just to Gregory as a boy, but further, to the days when that cabin wasn't just a piece of property or a backup plan. It was the place where my husband taught Gregory how to split wood, where I learned to patch leaky roofs and clean out the old stone fireplace with nothing but vinegar and salt. The floors creaked. The insulation was terrible, but it was ours. The first time we stayed there after Ron's funeral, it was early November. Cold had already settled in the valley. Gregory was 16, angry and quiet. I was still numb. I brought the urn wrapped in a wool blanket and placed it on the mantel. He didn't say much that trip, but one night after I'd gone to bed, I heard him downstairs. The next morning, there was a small pile of kindling perfectly stacked by the fireplace. That was his way of grieving. Years later, when Gregory asked if he could take over the cabin, I didn't say no, but I didn't say yes either. He never asked again. I suppose he took silence as permission. Now, looking back, I could see how easily assumptions grew into entitlement. And I had let it. I had allowed that belief to go unchecked, even encouraged it by staying quiet. But the cabin wasn't a gift to be claimed. It was the one piece of my life untouched by negotiation or performance. It was memory and loss and love, layered into wood and stone. I finished my coffee and placed the mug in the sink. Then I walked down the hallway to the hall closet and pulled out a photo box. Inside were prints from old disposable cameras, some faded, some sharp. One of Gregory on Ron's shoulders, fishing pole in hand. Another of me standing by the cabin porch apron, dusted with flour, holding out a plate of cinnamon rolls to two grinning boys. At the very bottom was the picture I didn't know I had kept. A Polaroid of Ron and I from the cabin's first winter. Snow behind us. Ron's arm around my shoulders, his handwriting on the back. Home is wherever we're stubborn enough to keep it. I held that photo a long time. Then I placed it next to the deed. I wasn't just holding on to a building. I was holding on to the last place where I had felt like myself completely and without condition. And maybe, just maybe, it was time I stopped waiting for someone else to see that. Maybe it was time I started seeing it again for myself. It had been nearly 7 years since I last saw Carol in person. We used to work together at the VA Medical Center in Oakland. She was the kind of woman who carried herself like she'd seen the worst of it and learned how to laugh anyway. After we both retired, we spoke on the phone once in a while, mostly holiday calls, or when someone from the old unit passed. But that Sunday morning, she showed up at my front door without warning. I opened it to see her standing there with a small bag of groceries and a look that said she already knew more than she should. She stepped in, gave me a quick hug, then walked straight to my kitchen like she had done it 1,000 times before. "You didn't even tell me it was Amelia's birthday," she said as she started unpacking the bag. "Eggs, bread, a pint of blueberries." I had to hear it from Sandra's daughter. Said Gregory's wife rented a bounce house and posted half the party online. I didn't respond. I just sat at the table and watched her make herself at home. She poured coffee for both of us, then finally sat across from me. "They didn't let you in, did they?" I shook my head once. Carol's expression didn't change much. She had worked trauma wards. She knew silence sometimes said more than a breakdown. "You ever update the title on that cabin?" she asked after a while. I reached for the deed, still resting on the buffet behind me, and slid it across the table. She read it over, nodded. "So it's still under your name. That's something." Then she leaned in slightly. "Listen, this isn't just a family rift. I've seen this pattern before. When people want to erase someone, they start with the story, but eventually they go after the paper trail. Your name, your place, your rights." Her words landed heavier than I expected. I stared at the edge of the table. "They think you're quiet. And maybe you have been," she continued. "But they don't get to write you out of the life you built. If they're using that cabin as leverage or part of some financial plan, you have every right to stop them." She pulled out a card and slid it to me. "Linda Alvarez, Elder Estate and Property Law. She's sharp. Younger than we were when we started, but she knows how to move through their kind of mess. Talk to her, Doris. Even if you don't act on it now, you need to know exactly where you stand." We spent the rest of the morning talking around old memories and half-burnt muffins. But Carol's visit wasn't just about comfort. It was a quiet nudge, a reminder that I still had choices, that I wasn't a ghost in someone else's version of events. After she left, I stared at Linda's card for a long time. It had been years since I stood up for myself in a way that made others uncomfortable. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe it was time they felt a little uncomfortable too. I met Linda Alvarez 2 days later in a modest office downtown, tucked between a bakery and an old bookstore. Her office was small but well organized, and everything about her said she meant business. No unnecessary charm, no talking down to me, just quiet confidence and clarity. Carol had already briefed her, Linda had the scanned deed, the property records, and surprisingly, a copy of Gregory's startup financing pitch deck. She had highlighted the section where he listed the cabin as a collateral asset. Your son is using the cabin to secure a second stage funding round. Her voice was calm, measured, which becomes a problem given that the title is still entirely under your name. I kept my face steady, though my stomach twisted. He claimed it was inherited, passed down to him with no dispute. She tapped her pen against the screen. And that no other party has ever contested ownership. I shook my head. I never signed a transfer, never agreed to joint ownership. That place was mine before his first tooth came in. Linda nodded, then leaned forward, elbows on her desk. You still hold the title. That gives you complete legal control. But if you don't take action, his lenders might move forward under the assumption that his claim is valid. We need to put them on notice. I sat back in the chair and stared out the window. It was quiet outside, just the hum of a delivery truck down the street. I don't want to sell it, and I don't want them building their dreams on something they pushed me out of. Linda listened. Then she offered the next step, filing a notice of claim. It would formally alert banks investors and any public record that the cabin's ownership was in question. Not aggressive, but firm. Once that's filed, she said, Gregory can't legally use the property for leverage, and you won't need to confront him directly. I'll handle all communication. If they reach out to you, just forward them here. She slid the papers toward me. I picked up the pen. My hand didn't shake. As I signed, I felt something shift in my chest. Not fear, not regret. Something closer to weight leaving my shoulders. I had stayed quiet for too long. I had allowed sentiment to cloud my position. But this place, this cabin, was more than wood and walls. It held memory, love, grief, firewood stacked by my late husband's hands, pancake mornings with Gregory's sticky fingers, evenings by the creek with the sound of crickets and no sound of judgment. Linda stood and walked me to the elevator. Just a heads up, this might rattle some people. Truth has a way of shaking the tree. I turned to her, steadier than I had been in years, then let it shake. The notice went out on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday evening, I had 8 missed calls from Gregory and 3 voicemails I didn't listen to. I also had a lengthy email from Elise, full of words like concern and misunderstanding. But I wasn't confused. I was clear. I didn't respond. Instead, I packed a small weekend bag and drove up to Walnut Creek with Carol. The cabin had always been my retreat, but that weekend it felt like something more, a reclamation. When we arrived, the front steps were still sturdy, though the paint on the railing had started to peel. The wind carried the familiar scent of pine and soil. Carol unlocked the door and pushed it open. Dust motes danced in the sunlight like a quiet welcome. The first thing I did was head to the kitchen. I opened the drawers, straightened the silverware, tossed out expired spices. Carol swept the floors and pulled back the curtains. We worked in silence like old friends who knew better than to fill the air with chatter. In the back hallway, I found the box of photographs Gregory had packed up years ago. I opened it slowly, lifting each frame like a fragile memory. There we were, the 3 of us, in wool sweaters, with red noses after sledding. Another photo showed Gregory perched on his father's shoulders, holding a tiny fishing rod. And then one of just me and my husband, standing by the stone fire pit, holding mugs of cider. I dusted off a frame and placed it back on the mantel. That one stayed. We didn't speak of the legal mess. Not out loud. It hung in the air like the mountain fog. Carol, ever practical, started a fire in the hearth. I brewed tea. We sat and listened to the crackling wood. That evening, as we sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Gregory. I saw the legal claim. You've made your point, but this is going to ruin things for me. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I turned off my phone and tucked it into the drawer beside the old rotary dial. The next morning, we hiked the short trail behind the cabin to the ridge where the creek wound through the trees. The trail was overgrown, but familiar. I hadn't walked it in years, but my feet remembered the way. At the edge of the path, the bench my husband built still stood, a little crooked but strong. We sat there for a while. The breeze moved gently through the tall grass. Carol handed me a thermos. "You did right," she said. "Not just legally, emotionally. You drew a line." I nodded. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel guilty. I felt whole. Later that afternoon, I took out a notebook from the desk drawer and wrote down what I wanted next. Not just legally, but for myself. I wrote the words out loud in my mind as I pressed the pen against the paper. I am not invisible. I am still here. And this place, this patch of trees, stone, and air was not theirs to erase me from. By Saturday morning, the fog had lifted from the valley below the cabin. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the light reach slowly over the tree line. There was a stillness in the air, but not the kind that felt empty. This was the kind that followed something hard-earned. At 10 o'clock, a silver SUV pulled up the gravel drive. A man stepped out, early 40s, trim suit, polished shoes, not meant for uneven ground. He didn't look up at the mountains or the trees. He walked straight to the porch, like he had somewhere better to be. I opened the door before he could knock. "Ms. Dorsey," he said, adjusting the strap on his briefcase. "My name is Matthew Klein. I represent your son." I let him in without a word. Carol, who had been reading in the living room, glanced over but said nothing. She offered him coffee. He declined. He opened his case and pulled out a folder. The air in the room changed just slightly. He spoke calmly, deliberately. "Gregory and Elise wish to resolve this without further escalation. They're willing to make a financial offer in exchange for your cooperation in transferring the property title. We believe it's in everyone's best interest to avoid further public exposure." He slid the folder across the table. I didn't touch it. He continued. "We would, of course, handle the paperwork discreetly. You would retain certain visitational rights if you wish. But full ownership would be transferred." His words were smooth, practiced. He spoke like someone used to getting yeses. I walked to the mantel and picked up the cabin deed. It had been resting in the wooden frame my husband made. I took it out and returned to the table. I opened the document and pointed to the line near the bottom. My full name written in ink, clear and permanent. "This is not just property," I said. "This is memory. This is promise. This is the last thing my husband touched before he died, and my name is still on it." Matthew didn't flinch, but he didn't press either. He closed his folder, stood, and nodded. "If you change your mind," he said, "we're open to further conversation." I walked him to the door. On the porch, he paused before stepping down. "You should know," he said, "this is already affecting Gregory's investors." I let that hang in the air. Then I said, "Everyone has to live with the consequences of what they erase." I closed the door gently. Behind me, Carol exhaled. We sat by the fire for a long time. The folder he left behind remained unopened. That night I burned it page by page. The flames curled around each offer, each signature line, each veiled threat dressed in courtesy. I didn't need their offer. I already had what they never would. A place that remembered me. By the following afternoon, the wind had picked up through the pines. I was stacking kindling near the back porch when I heard the gate creak. I thought it might be Carol returning from her walk, but the footsteps were lighter, quicker. I turned, and there she was. Amelia, hair tied back in a crooked ponytail. shoes a little muddy and cheeks pink from the cold. She was holding a worn tote bag, the kind I used to carry when I picked her up from school. She looked up at me, not saying anything, just looking. I froze, not out of fear or anger, but something deeper, something that ached with both joy and sadness. She walked up to me slowly and reached out her arms. I dropped the kindling. She wrapped herself around me like she used to, small and warm and silent. I didn't ask how she got here. I just held her. Inside, I warmed her hands with a cup of tea while she sat on the sofa, shoulders drawn in. She glanced around the cabin like it was a memory barely holding shape. I pointed to the fireplace. Your grandpa hung that mantle with his own hands. She looked at it, then back at me. She whispered, I saw your picture in a box in the closet. Mummy said she was going to take it down, but I took it first. Her voice cracked. Daddy never talks about you anymore. I didn't know where you went. I listened without rushing her. Her words came slowly, like they had waited too long to be spoken. She said, sometimes I look out the window and think I see you on the sidewalk. I think maybe if I wave, you'll wave back. I reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. You don't need to wave, I said. I'm still here. We spent the rest of the afternoon making a batch of old sugar cookies, the same ones I had baked every December. She remembered the shapes, even remembered which cutter made the crooked star. Later, we walked down to the creek. The water was low, but still sang over the stones. She skipped a pebble, then another. We sat on the wooden bench near the bend, the one Gregory had helped me build when he was barely 12. Amelia said, it's quieter here. I like that. Nobody talks over me here. I let the silence settle around us. When the sun started to fall, I walked her back to the cabin. Carol had returned by then and quietly started dinner. Amelia helped set the table. We ate together, just the three of us. No pressure, no explanations. Afterward, I called a driver I trusted to take her home. I wrapped the scarf I knitted years ago around her neck. She hugged me tight at the gate and whispered, I'm going to come back. I want to learn how to make the crooked stars by myself next time. I watched the car roll away down the gravel road, tail lights blinking through the trees. Inside the cabin, the warmth lingered. For the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like I was holding on to memories. It felt like I was making new ones. The next morning, frost still lingered on the windowsill. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stepped onto the porch, watching the mist lift slowly off the trees. The silence was different now, not empty, but expectant. When I opened my laptop, I noticed a new email from Elise. The subject line was plain, just my name. I stared at it for a long moment, then clicked. It read, this is affecting Gregory's reputation. Clients are asking questions. He's stressed beyond belief. I know you're hurt, but this isn't the way. I'm asking you woman to woman, please stop before it damages everything. No, dear. No apology. Just pleading, wrapped in a thin layer of civility. I sat still, letting the words settle like dust. I thought about Gregory's silence, his way of disappearing when responsibility pressed too close. Elise had always been the shield, the spokesperson, the one who smiled tightly at family dinners and changed the subject whenever it turned toward anything difficult. But now she was the one reaching out, not to heal, not to ask what had gone wrong, just to stop the noise. I took a breath, then hit reply. My fingers moved slowly. I didn't start this, I typed. You chose to erase me. Now I'm drawing myself back in. I hit send. Just one line. No threats, no drama. It was never about revenge. I had no appetite for battles. What I wanted was clarity, space, a boundary drawn clean. Later that afternoon, I stood at the old cedar desk in the cabin and pulled out the deed. My name was still there. Not his, not hers, mine. I placed the document in a folder marked Transfer of Stewardship. It was almost time. Carol helped me scan the final papers. Linda had drawn them up just as I'd asked. Everything would be official by next week. I glanced at the photo Amelia had brought from her house. It was a younger me holding her when she was barely 2. I propped it on the mantel next to one of Gregory at the same age. Same eyes, same smile, different roads. Outside, the wind shifted. A few birds scattered from the tree line. I closed the folder and smoothed my hand across the wood grain of the desk. It was the first piece of furniture my husband had ever built. Solid, worn, and still standing. So was I. The morning sun stretched over Walnut Creek as I walked down the gravel path toward the front gate. A new sign had been mounted to the post by the entrance. Hand-carved wood letters, painted in soft green. The cabin was no longer mine in the way it had once been, but it belonged to something larger now. A cause, a purpose. I hadn't just let go of a deed. I had chosen what it would become. The paperwork was finalized the day before. Carol was there when the representative from the non-profit signed the transfer. The organization had dedicated themselves to providing retreat spaces for widows, older women recovering from grief, and those seeking quiet renewal. I had explained that the cabin held more than wood and stone. It carried memory, warmth, a kind of shelter that wasn't just physical. They listened. They promised to preserve that feeling. Today, a local news crew arrived to cover the story. I stayed out of their way at first, but one of the reporters asked gently if I would stand for a photo in front of the hearth. I agreed. The photographer adjusted his lens. I stood with my back straight, one hand resting on the mantel. Above me hung the family picture Amelia had returned. The frame was slightly chipped, but it stayed. In that moment, I realized I was no longer just a bystander in my own story. I was the narrator, the architect, the keeper of memory and choice. Later, I walked out to the edge of the property. The trees whispered like they always had. I sat on the old bench, now polished and repaired, and let the wind comb through my hair. This place had once been built by a man who loved me. Now it would serve women finding their strength again. As I watched a group of volunteers unpack cushions and cookware, I smiled. Some stories don't end with a final chapter. They shift. They echo forward in other lives. Mine would echo here. If this story touched something inside you, if you've ever felt pushed aside, forgotten, or quietly erased, know this: your name still matters. Your presence carries weight. And sometimes reclaiming yourself begins with one quiet choice. Share your thoughts in the comments. Maybe someone out there needs to know they're not alone. And if this story reminded you of your own journey, I'd love to hear it. These stories connect us across generations, across silence. Thank you for listening. Let's keep building places where women feel seen, starting with the story in your hands.